Hello and welcome back to the Workbench. This is where we discuss ceiling fan history, trivia, and technical information. This has got to be one of the most requested topics for this series. The history of FASCO ceiling fans, the history of Thomas ceiling fans, and what was the connection between FASCO and Thomas ceiling fans. This has been an incredibly difficult video to research, probably the second most difficult of anything I've done so far. And part of that is because FASCO and Thomas are both, I'm going to start over. Hello and welcome back to the Workbench. This is where we discuss ceiling fan history, trivia, and technical information. Today, this is probably the most requested topic I get for this series. What is the history of FASCO ceiling fans? What is the history of Thomas ceiling fans? And how were they connected? This has been an incredibly difficult video to research. In part because Thomas and FASCO are both such huge behemoth companies that have been bought out so many times over the years, both with small, humble beginnings. Just to touch on that, FASCO was founded in 1911 as the F.A. Smith Manufacturing Company. They were making electric motors and small desk fans and things of that nature. Their name changed to FASCO Industries in 1950. And they weren't bought out, I believe, until the 80s. We'll touch on that later in the video. Thomas was founded in 1919 as Moe Brothers Lighting, was bought out by Lee B. Thomas in 1948, and the name was changed to Thomas Industries in 1953. I believe that is the most recent buyout affecting this video. They were bought out again in 1998, which is after the content in this video. So, that's our preliminary history. Let's get into the ceiling fans. In 1979, FASCO introduces their fan line. FASCO fan plants in Fayetteville, North Carolina did the stamping and assembly. They did not do any casting. They did not do any brass plating. They did not do any woodworking. The motors came from the FASCO plant in Missouri. Again, by this time, they're a huge company with plants everywhere. Blades and cast parts were brought in from third-party factories. FASCO did no plating, so all the brass parts were brought in already plated and stamped into their proper shapes. The Parlour Fan, the Centennial, and the Spartan were advertised. Spartan was sold only to lumber stores, home centers, and smaller lighting retailers. FASCO was the higher-end brand name for electrical wholesalers like Graybar, Rexel, and higher-end lighting showrooms. So when we talked about the past few videos with companies like Murray Feist and Craftmade having a cheaper line that they sell to home centers, and they sell the same thing under a different name for a higher price to, higher showrooms and things like that. FASCO did the same thing. Spartan was their cheaper home center lumberyard line, and then FASCO was their higher end line. That is 1979. In 1980, FASCO made fans for Thomas for 1 year only. Thomas Fuller and Douglas Bray designed the Thomas fans in coordination with FASCO. Thomas fans are advertised as British India. Thomas made their own light kits. FASCO bought light kits from other suppliers, including Thomas. FASCO did not make their own light kits. They bought light kits from Thomas. Thomas made their own light kits, which is why Thomas had a much bigger light kit line. That is 1980. In 1981, FASCO introduces their answer to Slumber Quiet, which is the SCR-based solid-state speed control, very low. Cane blades are introduced. It is the last year of Spartan being sold in JCPenney. After that, JCPenney went with, I think, Moss. It is the last year of the Centennial line by FASCO. And also in 1981, the heat cycler was designed by product manager Dennis Fallon. It was intended to be too ugly for residential use. They deliberately made it ugly so people would not try to use it residentially. Guess what? Steampunk designers loved it. They ended up selling a ton of them residentially. Go figure. Also in 1981, hawker Siddeley from England buys FASCO. This is when FASCO transitions from being a privately owned, family-owned company to being, part of a, big major corporation from overseas. Douglas Bray, a designer from Thomas, designed the first hugger fan in 1981. FASCO thought he was a genius. FASCO makes the first few fans for Thomas. Thomas wants cheaper production, and they source GE motors. FASCO thought the GE motors were garbage, and they're not interested in making fans any cheaper, so in 1981, FASCO stops making fans for Thomas. Thomas Fuller, the VP of Thomas and co-designer of the Thomas fans, becomes the president of FASCO. So there's definitely some back scratching going on both ways here, between the fans, the light kits, the promotions, etc. That's 1981. In 1982, FASCO introduces the ornate parlor fan, the Old South, the World's Fair, and the Charleston. Jarn Arbaugh, I said his name wrong. I guess I gotta start this over. I was doing so well. Hello and welcome back to the Workbench. This is where we discuss ceiling fan history, trivia, and technical information. This has got to be the most requested topic for this series. What is the history of FASCO ceiling fans? What is the history of Thomas ceiling fans? And how were they connected? So, first, a little preliminary history. FASCO was founded in 1911 as an electric motor and desk fan manufacturer. They were founded as the F.A. Smith Manufacturing Company in Rochester, New York. In 1950, they changed their name to FASCO Industries, and by the 70s, they're a huge corporation with plants in many states. Thomas Lighting was founded in 1919 by Henrik Moe as Moe Brothers Lighting Company. They were bought by Lee Thomas in 1948, changing the name to Thomas Industries in 1953, and again by the 70s they're a huge company with plants in many, many states. So let's get into their ceiling fan lines. That takes us to 1979. FASCO introduces their fan line. FASCO fan plants in Fayetteville, North Carolina did the stamping and assembly. They did not do any casting, they did not do any plating, they did not do any woodworking. Motors came from the FASCO plant in Missouri. Blades and cast parts were brought in from third-party factories. FASCO did no plating, so all the brass parts were brought in already plated and then stamped into their proper shapes. They introduced the Parlour Fan, the Centennial, and the Spartan. Spartan was sold only to lumber stores, home centers, and lower-end lighting retailers. Remember how we talked in the last few videos how some companies would sell the same fans to higher-end retailers for one name and then lower-end retailers for a lower price under a different name so they could sell the same thing to more people and make a bigger profit here? That's what FASCO did. They were selling the same fans as Spartan and as FASCO. Spartan was the name that they sold to lower-end retailers. FASCO, Centennial, etc. were the names that they sold to higher-end retailers. So, FASCO was the high-end name for electrical wholesalers like Graybar, Rexel, and then higher-end lighting showrooms. That's 1979. In 1980, FASCO made fans for Thomas for 1 year only. Thomas Fuller and Douglas Bray of Thomas designed the Thomas fans in coordination with FASCO. Thomas fans are advertised as British India. Thomas made their own light kits. FASCO bought light kits from other suppliers. They didn't make their own light kits, and one of the suppliers that they bought light kits from was Thomas. That's 1980. 1981. FASCO introduces their answer to slumber quiet, which is very low. It's their version of a solid-state control with an SCR designed to be quiet. They introduce cane blades. It is the last year of Spartan fans in JCPenney. After that, JCPenney went with David Moss. It is the last year of the Centennial, except for clearance. Also in 1981, the heat cycler was designed by product manager Dennis Fallon. It was intentionally designed to be too ugly for residential use. They did not want their residential customers buying it. They wanted them to buy the residential fans. Guess what? It ended up becoming very popular among steampunk and industrial style residential designers, and they sold a ton of them to residential designers anyway. Also in 1981, Hawker Siddeley from England buys FASCO. FASCO went from being a private, family-owned company to being owned by an overseas company in 1981. We're still in 1981. Douglas Bray, a designer for Thomas, designed the first hugger fan. FASCO thought he was a genius. FASCO makes the first few hugger fans for Thomas. Then Thomas says they want cheaper production and they start sourcing GE motors. FASCO thought the GE motors were garbage and they're not interested in using anybody else's motor. They're also not interested in making fans any cheaper. They're proud of their quality. They like how they make their fans. They're not interested in cutting any corners. So in 1981, FASCO stops making fan for Thomas. Thomas Fuller, the VP of Thomas and co-designer of the Thomas fans, becomes president of FASCO. So, as you can see, there's some back scratching going on in a few different directions here. FASCO's getting their light kits from Thomas. FASCO supplies fans for Thomas for a year. They share some designs, and then the vice president of Thomas becomes the president of FASCO. So that is all still. We're only at 1981. Let's go to 1982. FASCO is advertising the ornate parlor fan. This may have been the first year for the ornate parlor fan. I'm not sure. The Old South, I believe it's the first year for the World's Fair, and the Charleston. John Arbaugh, a FASCO salesman, designed the Charleston fan on a napkin while at lunch at the Holiday Inn Airport in Fayetteville, North Carolina. He handed the napkin to the CEO, and the CEO put it into production immediately. David Wilson, the current FASCO president before Thomas Fuller, and Rick Eden, a manager, designed the World's Fair fan series. Now, as for Thomas fans, keep in mind in 1982, they're no longer being made by FASCO. However, Thomas ends up buying some of the parts from the same suppliers that FASCO is using. Remember, FASCO doesn't make their own parts. All they do is assembly, stamping, and motors. So, in 1982 is when Thomas fans first show up with the rubber flywheel. Most of their fans still have the metal flywheel in 1982. The rubber flywheel model is called the Lancer. The metal flywheel model is called the British India. Okay, now let's go to 1983. FASCO fans are sold as Savannah for this year only, and the picture is of a second-generation Charleston. What I believe is that when the second-generation Charleston was first introduced, it was introduced as the Savannah and later transitioned to being the Charleston. Thomas, in 1983, are still selling metal and rubber flywheel fans sold by side. This is the last year of the British India series. So this is the last year that the metal flywheel fans are being made by Thomas, 1983. In 1984, now the FASCO Charleston is the second generation. So year previous, it was the Savannah. Now it's the second generation Charleston. They are nixing the Parlour Fan in 1984. No more Parlour Fan. And I think that is significant because as Thomas is phasing out that design, so is FASCO. So basically what they're trying to do is phase out their shared designs, and each company transitions into separate designs. That is 1984. And in fact, FASCO knowingly copied other manufacturers that year with the Boca Raton and the Olde Fayetteville. By this time, 1984, Thomas is all rubber flywheels. 1985. This is the last year that FASCO uses Spartan in advertising. It's the last use of the term parlor fan. Most of the ads in 1985 are for the Charleston. Thomas, in 1985, is all rubber flywheel fans, as well as some possible imported fans. We're not exactly sure when Thomas started importing fans. It could have been as early as 1985. And it is interesting because Thomas and FASCO both imported from Halsey. So clearly they were still, sharing, a little information there. In 1986, FASCO starts with their 5-blade fans, like the 5-blade Charleston, like the State Fair, etc. They introduced remote controls, and this is also the first year of imported FASCOs. That is 1986. In 1987, at FASCO, Tony Pierce and John Arbaugh designed the American Spirit fan line by going back and forth on a fax machine on a Saturday afternoon. They're not even in the office. They're just faxing each other designs back and forth on their day off until they settle on the design for the American Spirit, which became FASCO's second biggest selling fan of all time. That was 1987. In 1988, FASCO is promoting the Gulfstream, which is their imported line, very heavy. In 1988, Thomas's picture is of an import spinner. I didn't even know there were import spinners, like a spinner fan, sold under Thomas. That is 1988. 1990, FASCO is back to promoting the Charleston heavy. 1991, FASCO is promoting the Snugger, the Vanity Fair, the Decorator, the Florentine, the American Spirit. They all show up in ads by name. The Porchfan shows up by name. So in 1991, they're promoting their American and import lines side by side very heavily. In 1981 is when Thomas fans are very clearly Halsey 5-blade fans. They probably were a lot earlier, but they show up very definitively in 1991. Did I say 81 or 91? Okay, I gotta do it over. I've screwed up a few times here. I've been doing really good, though. Hello, and welcome back to the Workbench. This is where we discuss ceiling fan history, trivia, and technical information. Today's video is probably the most heavily requested topic for this series. The history of FASCO ceiling fans, the history of Thomas ceiling fans, and how were they connected. So, first, a little preliminary history, because both of them started out as very small companies over 100 years ago to become very large companies by the time they started making ceiling fans. FASCO was founded as the F.A. Smith Manufacturing Company in Rochester, New York in 1911. They changed their name to FASCO Industries in 1950, and by the 70s they had factories in many states. Very, very big company. Thomas Lighting was founded in 1919 as Moe Brothers Lighting. They were bought out by Lee Thomas in 1948, changed their name to Thomas Industries in 1953, and again by the 70s they were a huge company with plants in many states. So let us fast forward to 1979. FASCO introduces their fan line. FASCO plants in Fayetteville, North Carolina did the stamping and assembly. The motors came from the FASCO plant in Missouri. Blades and cast parts were brought in from third-party factories. FASCO did no plating, so all the brass parts were brought in already plated and then stamped into the proper shapes. They also didn't do any casting. They didn't do any woodworking. They bought all those parts cast. They bought the blades as is and brought them in and assembled the fans. In 1979, they introduced the Parlour Fan, the Centennial, and the Spartan. Spartan was their lower end line to Hello and welcome back to the Workbench. This is where we discuss ceiling fan history, trivia, and technical information. Today's topic has got to be the most heavily requested topic for this series. The history of FASCO fans, the history of Thomas fans, and how were they connected. So, first, a little preliminary history. FASCO was founded as the F.A. Smith Manufacturing Company in 1911, making electric motors and desk fans. They changed their name to FASCO Industries in 1950, and by the 70s, they were a huge company with plants in many states making many different things. Thomas Lighting was founded in 1919 as Moe Brothers Lighting. They made residential lighting fixtures. It had to be really early, and when we even... I'm going to start over.